For 3 long years, Tessa survived the shark tank by staying entirely invisible, answering calls, scheduling shell company audits, and pouring coffee while the water slowly turned red. The cardinal rule of her survival shattered today, however, when a boardroom full of armed men began screaming over a hijacked shipment. Instead of reaching for his gun, Declan reached for her, pulling Tessa straight onto his lap and refusing to let go. The air in the 42nd floor boardroom tasted like stale coffee and copper. It always did when the monthly logistics meetings ran long. Tessa stood by the mahogany credenza, a stack of heavily redacted manifests pressed against her chest. Officially, she was the executive assistant to the CEO of Hayes Global Freight. Unofficially, she managed the schedule of a man who controlled the largest organized crime syndicate on the eastern seaboard. It paid well. She just had to learn how to turn off her conscience and perfect the art of blending into the wallpaper. Today, the wallpaper was peeling. At the head of the table sat Declan Hayes. He didn't look like a mob boss. There were no tracksuits, no thick gold chains, no cigar smoke. Declan wore a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than her first car. His dark hair was neatly parted, his jaw shaved clean. He looked like a ruthless venture capitalist. But the men flanking the long table, men with flattened noses, cauliflower ears, and bulges under their suit jackets, told a different story. Declan was silent. He usually was. He let the dogs bark until they exhausted themselves. Right now, the loudest dog was Leo Rossi. Leo was a mid-level lieutenant who managed the docks in South Boston. He was sweating through his collar. His face flushed a dangerous mottled red. 3 shipping containers of unregistered European firearms had vanished from berth 14, and Leo was currently trying to explain why it wasn't his fault. "It's the new customs guys, boss," Leo said, his voice grating against the heavy silence of the room. He planted both hands on the table, leaning forward. "They're crawling all over the shipyard. We couldn't move the merchandise without lighting a flare. I made a judgment call to hold them back, and somebody tipped off the Irish. It's a leak. It ain't incompetence." Declan slowly rotated a silver pen between his fingers. Tap, tap, tap. The sound echoed off the floor-to-ceiling windows. Outside, the city was a grid of indifferent grey beneath a heavy, overcast sky. Inside, the tension was thick enough to choke on. "3 million in merchandise, Leo," a man named Sullivan chimed in from the left. "You don't lose 3 million and blame a leak. You blame the guy holding the keys." "Shut your mouth, Sully," Leo snapped, his head whipping around. "You sit up here in your glass tower. You don't know what it's like down there right now. It's a war zone." "Gentlemen," Declan's voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The single word dropped into the room like a lead weight, killing the argument instantly. The silver pen stopped tapping. Declan set it down parallel to the leather blotter. Everything about him was precise. Terrifyingly precise. He didn't look at Leo. He looked at Tessa. "Tessa," Declan said. "Yes, Mr. Hayes." Her voice was perfectly modulated. Calm, professional, detached. The tone she had spent 3 years perfecting. "Hand out the revised port schedules, please." "Right away." She stepped away from the credenza. Her heels clicked a steady rhythm on the hardwood. She walked behind the seated men, sliding a blue folder onto the table next to each of them. She kept her eyes focused on the polished wood. Never make eye contact. Never linger. She was a ghost haunting a boardroom of killers. She reached Leo's chair. He was still radiating heat, vibrating with unspent adrenaline and rising panic. He knew Declan wasn't buying his story. He knew a failure of this magnitude usually resulted in a quiet drive to a very deep quarry. As she slid the folder past Leo's elbow, he suddenly slammed his fist onto the table. "It's a setup!" Leo shouted, the sudden movement causing his chair to scrape violently against the floor. He shoved himself up, towering over the table. Tessa flinched. It was a microscopic movement, a tiny involuntary step backward, but her hip bumped the edge of the heavy mahogany table. She dropped a folder. The papers spilled across the floor, white rectangles stark against the dark wood. "I ain't taking the fall for this, Declan," Leo yelled, his arm sweeping out in a broad, aggressive gesture. His knuckles grazed her shoulder. It wasn't a deliberate strike, just the collateral damage of a panicked man throwing a tantrum, but the force of it sent her stumbling a half step toward the head of the table. Everything happened in a fraction of a second. Leo reached inside his jacket. It was a suicidal move. Sullivan and 3 other men instantly sprang to their feet, hands darting to their own waistbands. Tessa was caught in the middle. She was in the crossfire. Her cynical brain calculated the trajectory of a bullet in a closed room, and her breath seized in her throat. She braced for the deafening crack of gunfire, but the gunshot never came. Instead, a hand locked onto her wrist. The grip was forged steel. It didn't hurt, but it was absolute. Before she could process the touch, the hand pulled. Hard. The world tilted violently. The floor dropped out from under her. She fell, gasping, braced for the harsh impact of the hardwood floor. She didn't hit the floor. She hit solid muscle, layered beneath expensive wool. Her breath rushed out of her lungs in a sharp whoosh. She blinked, her vision swimming for a second as her brain struggled to orient itself. She wasn't on the ground. She was on Declan Hayes's lap. For 2 full seconds, the universe simply stopped. The blood roaring in her ears was the only sound in the world. Tessa was sitting sideways across Declan's thighs. Her skirt had ridden up slightly, exposing her knees. Her hands, acting on pure instinct, had flattened against his chest to brace her fall. Beneath her palms, she felt the crisp cotton of his shirt, the warmth radiating from his skin, and the steady, slow, impossibly calm rhythm of his heart. He wasn't breathing fast. He wasn't panicked. His left arm came around her waist. He didn't grope her. He didn't pull her into something intimate. He simply clamped his forearm across her stomach, anchoring her to him with the casual, heavy possession of a man securing a valuable piece of property during an earthquake. The boardroom was a portrait of frozen violence. Leo stood with his hand still shoved inside his jacket, his face drained of all color, staring at the head of the table. Sullivan had a Glock halfway drawn. The other men were frozen in various states of aggressive readiness. And they were all staring at her. At them. She tried to scramble up. The heat rising in her cheeks was excruciating. Her professional armor, the detachment, the invisibility, shattered into 1,000 humiliating pieces. "Mr. Hayes, His arm flexed, a microscopic tightening that pinned her in place. The message was clear. Stay. She froze. She didn't dare move. She sat there, perched on the lap of a monster, feeling a completely unhinged mixture of absolute terror and a bizarre, heavy sense of safety. Declan didn't look at her. He didn't acknowledge her weight on him, or her hands trembling against his chest. He looked straight past her shoulder, at Leo. "Take your hand out of your jacket, Leo," Declan said. His voice was a low, raspy murmur. It lacked any inflection. It was the voice of a man who already knew how the next 10 minutes would play out, regardless of what anyone else did. Leo swallowed hard. The sound was audible in the dead silence of the room. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, he pulled his hand out of his jacket. It was empty. He raised both hands, palms facing out. "Boss, I wasn't pulling a piece. I swear to God, I was grabbing my phone to show you the texts from the harbor master." Leo's voice shook. The bluster was entirely gone, replaced by the hollow rattle of a man pleading for his life. "Sit down," Declan said. Leo collapsed into his chair as if his strings had been cut. Sullivan and the others slowly holstered their weapons and took their seats, the leather groaning under their shifting weight. No one looked at her. It was a sudden, collective agreement among a dozen lethal men to pretend that the CEO's secretary wasn't currently trapped against his chest. Tessa felt Declan shift slightly beneath her. The muscles in his thighs were rock solid. The scent of him enveloped her completely. Cedar wood, fresh linen, and a faint metallic undertone that reminded her of impending rain. It was intoxicating and terrifying. She realized, with a sickening drop in her stomach, that she had her face inches from his neck. She carefully turned her head away, staring rigidly at the far wall, trying to make herself as light as possible. She couldn't be invisible when she was the center of gravity in the room. "Let's address the reality of the situation," Declan continued, his tone conversational. His left arm remained firmly around her waist. His right hand reached out and picked up the silver pen again. "You lost the shipment, Leo. I don't care if it was a leak. I don't care if customs suddenly decided to do their jobs. You are paid to ensure the environment is secure. It wasn't. I'll get it back. I just need a week," Leo pleaded. "You have 48 hours, Declan said. "You find the leak, you plug it, you recover the crates. If you can't do that, you don't come back to this office." Declan's chest moved against her as he spoke. She could feel the deep, baritone vibration of his voice resonating through her own ribs. It was an incredibly intimate sensation in an incredibly public, violent setting. 48 hours. Understood. Thank you, boss. Leo was practically sweating blood, nodding rapidly. "We are done here," Declan said, tossing the pen back onto the blotter. The men didn't need to be told twice. They stood up in unison. Folders were snapped shut. Chairs were pushed in. There was a desperate, unspoken scramble to exit the room. They filed out the double-glass doors, their eyes glued to the floor, careful not to cast a single glance toward the head of the table. Sullivan was the last to leave. He paused at the door, gave a curt nod, and pulled the heavy doors shut behind him. The lock clicked. They were alone. The silence rushed back in, thicker and heavier than before. The hum of the air conditioning sounded like a jet engine. Tessa was still sitting on his lap. His arm was still around her waist. Her mind screamed at her to move, to apologize, to smooth her skirt and pretend this was just a weird workplace safety protocol. But her body betrayed her. She felt a slow, heavy warmth seeping from where his arm pressed against her stomach, radiating outward, relaxing muscles she didn't know she had been clenching for 3 years. She finally turned her head to look at him. Declan's head was tilted back slightly against the leather of his executive chair. His eyes, a shade of blue so pale they were almost grey, were fixed on her. They weren't cold anymore. They were unreadable, dark, and intensely focused. "Are you hurt?" he asked quietly. "No." Her voice came out as a breathless whisper. She cleared her throat, desperate to claw back some shred of dignity. "No, Mr. Hayes. I'm fine." She placed her hands on the armrests of his chair and pushed herself up. For a second, she thought his arm tightened, refusing to let her go. A spike of pure adrenaline hit her bloodstream, but then his grip fell away, his arm dropping to his side. She scrambled backward, putting 3 feet of solid floor between them. She obsessively smoothed down her skirt, tugging at the hem, her fingers trembling slightly. She kept her eyes on his polished Oxford shoes. "I apologize," she said, reverting to the script. "I lost my footing when he moved. I should have maintained better spatial awareness." It was a ridiculous thing to say. She sounded like a security contractor, not a secretary. But words were a shield, and she needed armor. Declan didn't move. He sat in the chair, watching her frantic adjustments. The loss of his body heat was abrupt, leaving her front feeling cold and exposed in the heavily air-conditioned room. Spatial awareness, he repeated. The corner of his mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a smile. It was more like the ghost of a threat. Leo was reaching into a jacket that usually holds a .38 caliber pistol, Tessa. You were standing in his blind spot. I didn't think he would actually draw a weapon in here, she replied. Never assume logic in a desperate man, Declan said. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, bringing his face closer to her level. He was angry. He was backed into a corner. When men like Leo get scared, they don't look at where they're swinging. She finally looked up from his shoes, meeting his eyes. The pale blue was intense, pinning her in place just as effectively as his arm had. You pulled me, she said, the words slipping out before her cynical filter could stop them. You could have just told me to move. There wasn't time. You put yourself in the line of fire. If he had pulled a gun, you were holding a human shield. It was a test, a nasty, cynical poke at his motives. She needed to know if he pulled her down to protect her or to use her as Kevlar. In this world, you bet on the latter. Declan stared at her for a long moment. The silence stretched, pulling taut like piano wire. He didn't look offended. He looked fascinated. If Leo had cleared leather, Declan said softly, he would have been dead before his barrel cleared the table. Sullivan had him sighted. I wasn't worried about bullets, Tessa. Then why? She demanded, her voice rising a fraction of an inch, breaking the professional veneer. Why do that? Why in front of them? Because he touched you. The words were spoken simply, as if stating a fundamental law of physics. Gravity makes things fall. Water is wet. Leo touched you, so I took you away from him. A cold shiver raced down her spine, warring with the lingering heat in her stomach. He bumped into me, she corrected, taking another half step back. It was an accident. It doesn't matter, Declan said, standing up. He moved with a smooth, terrifying grace for a man his size. He was suddenly much taller than her, casting a long shadow across the carpet. In this room, in this building, no one touches you, accident or otherwise. Tessa crossed her arms over her chest, a pathetic defensive barrier. I am your secretary, Mr. Hayes. I am an employee. I am not a piece of china. I am well aware of what you are, Tessa. He took a step toward her. She held her ground, barely. Her heart was battering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Then you know that what just happened in here changes things, she said, her voice tight. She was a survivor. She understood the ecosystem of the syndicate better than most of the thugs with guns. Power was about perception. They saw you hold me. They saw you prioritize me during a conflict. I'm not invisible anymore. Declan stopped inches from her. He reached out. She flinched, expecting him to grab her arm again, but he just gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers brushed against the sensitive skin of her jawline. His touch was burning hot. You were never invisible, he murmured, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated straight through her chest. You just thought you were. He let his hand drop. He stepped around her, walking toward the double doors. Take the rest of the afternoon off, Tessa, he said over his shoulder, his tone instantly snapping back to the detached, clipped rhythm of a CEO dismissing his staff. I'll need the quarterly projections on my desk by 9 tomorrow. He opened the door and walked out, leaving her alone in the sterile boardroom. She stood there for a long time, staring at the empty doorway. The smell of cedar and mint still hung in the air. She looked down at the floor, where the blue folders she had dropped were scattered like fallen leaves. She bent down and began to pick them up, her hand still shaking slightly. She had come to this job for the money, intending to keep her head down, do the math, and ignore the blood. She had played the game perfectly for 3 years. But as she stacked the papers back together, gripping them tightly against her chest, a cynical, terrifying truth settled over her. Declan Hayes hadn't just saved her from a flailing lieutenant today. He had claimed her. He had drawn a line in the sand in front of his most dangerous men, pulling her onto his side of it. She was no longer the girl in the background. She was a target. And worse, God help her. Part of her liked it. The shift happened overnight. It wasn't an explosion. It was a change in the barometric pressure. When Tessa swiped her badge at the ground floor turnstiles the next morning, Frank, the night shift security guard who usually spent his morning staring blankly at a monitor, stood up. He actually stood up. He gave her a sharp, respectful nod. "Morning, Miss Tessa," he said, his voice dropping a full octave into a tone of quiet deference. "Morning, Frank," she replied, her voice tight. She walked to the private elevator bank. The polished steel doors slid shut, sealing her in the mirrored box. She watched her reflection as the numbers ticked upward to 42. She looked exactly the same. Navy blue pencil skirt, crisp white blouse buttoned to the collarbone, low tortoiseshell heels, hair pulled back into a severe knot. She looked like an auditor. She looked like a ghost. But the ghost had a shadow now, and it was cast by a 6'2" crime boss. The executive floor was unnervingly quiet. It was 7:40 in the morning. Usually the heavy hitters didn't roll in until 9, leaving her the early hours to organize the chaos of the syndicate's legitimate fronts. Today, however, as she walked past the glass-walled conference rooms, she noticed 3 men in tailored suits standing by the water cooler. Enforcers. Men who usually operated out of the warehouses in the Bronx. They stopped talking the second her heels clicked onto the marble. They didn't stare. That was the terrifying part. They explicitly avoided looking at her. They stared at their coffee cups, the ceiling, the floor. One of them actually took a half-step backward to give her a wider berth as she walked toward the CEO's antechamber. It was the physical manifestation of "do not touch." She reached her desk. Her hands were clammy. She set her bag down and booted up her terminal. She tried to focus on the quarterly projections Declan had demanded. Spreadsheets were safe. Numbers behaved rationally. If a column didn't balance, you found the error. There was no hidden agenda in a pivot table. She spent an hour lost in the comforting rhythm of data entry, trying to ignore the prickle of paranoia at the nape of her neck. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy oak door to Declan's inner office swung open. "Tessa," she jumped. Her elbow knocked against her coffee mug, sending a few brown drops splattering onto the mahogany veneer. She grabbed a tissue and wiped it up frantically. "Yes, Mr. Hayes." Declan stood in the doorway. He had abandoned the jacket of his charcoal suit. His sleeves were rolled up to the elbows, exposing thick forearms corded with muscle and a faint, jagged scar running along his left wrist. He looked tired. A shadow of dark stubble lined his jaw, softening the sharp angles of his face, but making him look infinitely more dangerous. "Projections," he said. "Printed and collated," she said, picking up the thick, leather-bound folder. She walked over to him. Her heart immediately started that frantic, bird-like fluttering against her ribs. She hated it. She hated that her body was reacting to him like prey, or worse, like a woman. She extended the folder. He didn't take it. Instead, he stepped back, leaving the doorway open. It was a silent command to enter. She swallowed hard and walked into the lion's den. Declan's office was a cavern of dark wood, leather, and panoramic glass overlooking the grey sprawl of the city. Rain had begun to lash against the windows, distorting the skyline into a blurry watercolour. "Put them on the desk," he said, walking over to a crystal decanter resting on a side table. He poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a tumbler. It was barely breakfast time. She set the folder precisely in the centre of his blotter. The logistics subsidiary took a 4% hit due to the fuel surcharges, but the warehousing acquisitions in New Jersey offset the loss. You're up 2.5% overall for the quarter. "I don't care about the legitimate margins right now," Declan said, taking a sip of the bourbon. He turned to face her. "Sit down." She sat in one of the 2 wingback chairs facing his desk. She kept her knees pressed tightly together, her hands folded in her lap. He didn't sit behind his desk. He walked around it and leaned against the edge, crossing his ankles. He was entirely too close. She could smell the bourbon, mixed with that intoxicating scent of cedar and impending violence. "How was your commute?" he asked. The question threw her. "The end train was delayed, standard." "Did anyone speak to you?" "Frank downstairs said good morning. He usually doesn't." Declan swirled the liquid in his glass. "Good. The ecosystem is adjusting." "I don't want the ecosystem to adjust, Mr. Hayes," she said. The words tumbled out, fueled by the lingering anxiety of the morning. "I want to do my job. I want to audit the shell companies, manage your calendar, and go home to my cat. I do not want your enforcers treating me like an unexploded bomb. They are treating you with respect. They are treating me with fear. Because of you. Fear is a much more reliable currency than respect, Tessa," he said softly. "Not for me. I'm a civilian." Declan let out a low, humorless exhale. "You haven't been a civilian since the day you signed my NDA and started washing $3 million a week through our real estate holdings. You know exactly what we do here. Knowing about the blood isn't the same as wearing it," she shot back, her voice rising slightly. She gripped the armrests of the chair. "Yesterday, you made me a physical part of the narrative. You put a target on my back. I removed a target from your back." His voice turned razor-sharp, cutting through her panic. He set the glass down on the desk with a heavy thud. He leaned down, placing a hand on the armrest of her chair, caging her in. "Do you think Leo is a rational man? Do you think the men in that room look at a beautiful woman who knows all our financial secrets and view her as a civilian?" Her breath caught. "Beautiful?" She stared at his collarbone, unable to meet his eyes. "You were a liability they tolerated because I commanded it," Declan murmured, his face inches from hers. "Yesterday, Leo forgot himself. He let his panic override his discipline. If I hadn't made an absolute, undeniable demonstration of your untouchability, someone else would have tested the boundaries eventually." "So I'm what?" she whispered. "Your property?" "You are under my protection," he corrected, his breath ghosting over her temple. "And in my world, those 2 things are indistinguishable." He pushed himself off the chair, breaking the proximity. The cold air of the office rushed back in, but her skin was burning. "We have 36 hours before Leo's deadline expires," Declan said, his tone shifting instantly back to the ruthless CEO. "Cancel all my afternoon meetings. If Leo doesn't find the leak, I have a mess to clean up on the docks." "Yes, Mr. Hayes." She stood up on shaky legs. She turned and walked to the door. Just as her hand touched the brass handle, his voice stopped her. "Tessa." She looked back over her shoulder. He was standing by the window, a dark silhouette against the rainy skyline. "For what it's worth," he said quietly. "I didn't pull you down yesterday just for the demonstration." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The implication hung in the heavy air between them, terrifying and electric, as she pulled the door shut behind her. Fear is an excellent motivator, but spite is a close second. Tessa spent the next 24 hours vibrating with a toxic mix of both. Declan's words echoed in her skull. "You know exactly what we do here. You haven't been a civilian since the day you signed." He was right, and she hated him for it. She had justified her complicity by hiding behind the spreadsheets. She told herself she was just moving numbers, balancing ledgers. She didn't pull triggers. She didn't extort unions. She just made sure the IRS didn't look too closely at a chain of laundromats in Queens. But the truth was, she was the grease in the gears of a murder machine. And now, the machine was looking at her. The 48-hour deadline for Leo Rossi was bleeding away. The atmosphere on the executive floor was suffocating. Enforcers paced the hallways like caged tigers. Sullivan, the lieutenant who had drawn his gun in the boardroom, had practically moved into the conference room down the hall, running a makeshift command center to track the missing weapons. Leo was failing. Word on the floor was that he was tearing South Boston apart, breaking fingers and kicking down doors. But the $3 million in European firearms had vanished into thin air. If Leo didn't find the guns by tomorrow morning, Declan would have him killed. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a corporate restructuring in the syndicate. She sat at her desk at 6 in the evening. The floor had mostly emptied out, leaving only a skeletal crew of security and Sullivan's men. She was supposed to be running a routine compliance check on a new shell company in Delaware, a holding firm for maritime logistics. Instead, she was hunting. Declan had said Leo wasn't a rational man, but Sullivan was. Sullivan was the one who had immediately called for Leo's head in the boardroom. Sullivan was the one who was perfectly positioned to take over the South Boston docks if Leo was eliminated. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. She bypassed the standard accounting software and dug into the raw encrypted transaction logs on the mainframe. She knew the back doors. She had built half of them. She started pulling the banking records for the maritime logistics firm. She cross-referenced the dates of the missing shipment with anomalous cash infusions into their legitimate offshore accounts. Nothing. The money was clean. She rubbed her tired eyes. She was grasping at straws. She was a secretary playing detective because a mob boss smelled like cedar and made her heart race. It was pathetic. She was about to shut the terminal down when a tiny discrepancy caught her eye. A subsidiary routing number. It was buried 3 layers deep in a holding company meant to handle equipment depreciation for the shipping containers. There was a wire transfer of $250,000 executed 48 hours before the guns were stolen from berth 14. The money hadn't gone out. It had come in. Someone had been paid $250,000 as a deposit. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She traced the origin of the wire. It was routed through a dizzying maze of shell banks in the Caymans, but the original point of deposit was a domestic account flagged by a private wealth management firm in Manhattan. She hacked the wealth management firm's public directory, matching the routing prefix to their client rosters. It took 20 minutes of brute force cross-referencing, sweat pooling at the small of her back. Finally, the screen blinked. A match. The account belonged to a man named Garrett Vance. She froze. She knew that name. Garrett Vance wasn't a rival mobster. He wasn't Irish or Russian. He was the chief customs inspector for the port of Boston. The puzzle pieces snapped together with a sickening crunch. Leo hadn't lost the shipment to a leak. The customs raid wasn't an accident. The inspector had been bribed to seize the containers. The weapons weren't missing on the street. They were sitting safely in a federal impound lot, waiting to be auctioned off or quietly diverted. But who paid the customs inspector? She dug deeper into the Delaware Holding Company's authorization logs. Who had the executive clearance to authorize a $250,000 wire transfer without flagging Declan's daily audit? 3 people. Declan, Tessa, and Sullivan. She leaned back in her ergonomic chair, the air suddenly sucked out of the room. Sullivan paid the customs inspector to raid Leo's dock. Sullivan fabricated the story of a leak. Sullivan set Leo up to take the fall, knowing Declan would execute Leo for the failure. Once Leo was dead, Sullivan would absorb the South Boston territory. It was a coup, a quiet, bloody, bureaucratic coup. She looked at the clock. 7:30 p.m. The deadline was tomorrow morning. If she walked away, closed her laptop and went home, Leo Rossi would have his brains blown out in a quarry before sunrise. A man would die because she chose to remain invisible. But if she printed this ledger, if she took this proof to Declan, she was crossing the Rubicon. She was no longer the secretary balancing the books. She was an active participant in syndicate warfare. She would be signing Sullivan's death warrant. She looked at her hands. They were trembling violently. She thought about Leo's panicked face. She thought about Sullivan's cold eyes. And then she thought about a muscular arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her out of the line of fire. In this room, no one touches you. She hit print. The printer whirred to life in the corner, spitting out 3 pages of damning, irrefutable data. She gathered the warm sheets of paper. She didn't put them in a folder. She rolled them tightly into her fist. She stood up and walked toward Declan's office. The heavy oak doors were closed. A sliver of golden light spilled from beneath the gap. She didn't knock. She pushed the handle and walked in. Declan was sitting behind his desk, illuminated only by the glow of a green-shaded banker's lamp and the ambient city light bleeding through the rain-streaked windows. He had a disassembled Sig Sauer 9mm pistol laid out on a microfiber cloth in front of him. He was methodically oiling the recoil spring. It was a stark, horrifying reminder of exactly who she was dealing with. He didn't look up when the door opened. His hands continued their precise, fluid motions. "I explicitly recall telling you to go home at 5, Tessa," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rasp in the quiet room. Tessa walked across the vast expanse of the Persian rug. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the metallic snick of him reassembling the barrel of the gun. She reached his desk. She slammed the rolled-up papers down onto the mahogany right next to the disassembled weapon. "Leo didn't lose the guns," she said. Her voice shook, but she forced it to stay loud. "He was set up." Declan's hands stopped moving. He slowly raised his head. The pale blue eyes caught the light of the lamp, flashing with a sudden, predatory sharpness. He looked at the papers, then up at her face. "Explain," he said. A single word, heavy with command. "The customs raid at berth 14 wasn't a fluke. It was bought." She pointed a shaking finger at the top sheet of paper. "I traced a wire transfer from the Delaware Maritime holding account. $250,000 paid to a domestic account belonging to Garrett Vance, the chief customs inspector. The money was wired 48 hours before the raid." Declan didn't touch the papers. He just stared at her, his jaw tightening into a hard line. "Who authorized the wire?" "You know who," she breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. "There are only 3 digital signatures that can clear that amount from that specific shell without flagging your daily brief. You. Me." She swallowed the bile rising in her throat. "And Sullivan?" The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a vacuum before a detonation. Declan looked down at the ledger. He didn't read the numbers. He just stared at the page. A muscle in his jaw feathered. Slowly, he picked up the slide of the pistol, slotted it onto the frame, and racked it with a sharp, violent metallic crack that made her flinch. He set the assembled loaded weapon on the desk. "How did you find this?" he asked softly. Too softly. "I ran a compliance check." "Do not lie to me, Tessa." His voice cracked like a whip in the dark room. He stood up, towering over the desk. A compliance check wouldn't flag a Cayman routing shell. You had to dig into the encrypted mainframe. You had to manually bypass the firewall I paid $1 million to build. You went hunting. "I was trying to help," she defended, taking a step back as he walked around the desk. "Help who? Leo?" Declan closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. The fury rolling off him was palpable, a physical heat radiating in the cold room. "Do you think Leo is a good man? Do you think he deserves your protection?" "I think he doesn't deserve to be executed for something he didn't do." "And Sullivan?" Declan cornered her against one of the leather wingback chairs. "Did you stop to consider what happens now that you've unearthed this?" "Sullivan has 6 armed men sitting 40 feet down the hallway. If he knows you hacked that ledger, he will shoot you in the head before you reach the elevator. And I wouldn't be able to stop a bullet in flight." "He doesn't know," she said, her voice trembling. She was pressed against the chair, trapped by Declan's sheer size. "I scrubbed the terminal logs. You played a game you do not understand." He reached out, planting both hands on the arms of the chair behind her, trapping her completely. His face was inches from hers. She could see the furious pulse beating at the base of his throat. "You stepped out of the shadows, Tessa. I warned you yesterday. You dig into the blood money. You get blood on your hands." "I couldn't just let him die," she whispered, tears of pure adrenaline pricking her eyes. "I know I'm just the secretary. I know I'm supposed to look away. But I couldn't." Declan stared down at her. The anger in his eyes slowly, agonizingly, fractured. It shifted into something darker, heavier, and infinitely more terrifying. "You are not just a secretary," he rasped, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You haven't been just a secretary since the day I hired you. Do you think I let just anyone manage my money? Do you think I let just anyone stand behind me in a room full of wolves?" He moved his right hand from the chair and brought it to her face. His large, calloused palm cupped her jaw. The touch was possessive, desperate, and burning hot. His thumb brushed over her cheekbone, wiping away a stray tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "I spent 3 years building a wall between you and the reality of what I am," Declan murmured, his eyes dropping to her lips. "I kept you in the glass tower. I kept you clean. And in 2 days, you've managed to tear it all down." "I had to," she breathed, her eyelids fluttering shut at the intense heat of his touch. The fear was melting away, replaced by a heavy, pulling gravity. "I know," he said. He didn't pull her onto his lap this time. He didn't need a physical crisis as an excuse. Declan stepped into her space, pressing her back flat against the leather chair, and wrapped his arm around her waist. He pulled her flush against his chest. She felt the solid wall of his muscles, the heavy thud of his heart, the holster strapped beneath his shoulder. He leaned down and buried his face in the crook of her neck. He inhaled sharply, a shuddering breath that vibrated through her entire body. "God help me," he whispered against her skin. "I'm going to have to kill half my crew to keep you safe." She raised her trembling hands and placed them flat against his chest, gripping the fabric of his shirt. She wasn't bracing for a fall anymore. She was holding on. In the quiet, dark office, with a loaded gun on the desk and a war brewing in the hallway, Tessa realized the terrifying truth. She wasn't just a target. She was the reason the war was going to start. The warmth of his body was violently stripped away as Declan took a sudden step back. The air in the office instantly plummeted 10 degrees. The vulnerability in his eyes, that brief, terrifying crack in his armor, vanished. It was replaced by a sterile, freezing emptiness. The man who had just buried his face in her neck was gone. The CEO of Hayes Global Freight was back, and he was calculating the geometry of a bloodbath. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Tessa watched, paralyzed as he walked back to the mahogany desk. He picked up the loaded Sig Sauer. He ejected the magazine, checked the brass casings gleaming in the dim light, and slammed it back into the grip with a sharp, decisive clack. "Get your bag, Tessa," he ordered. His voice was a flat line. She scrambled to the wingback chair, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hook her fingers through the straps of her leather tote. When she turned around, Declan was standing by the mahogany bookshelf on the far wall. He reached behind a thick, leather-bound volume of tax codes and pressed something. There was a heavy, pneumatic hiss. The entire bookshelf swung outward, revealing a solid steel door. A keypad glowed red in the shadows. He punched in a 6-digit code. The steel door unsealed with a heavy metallic groan. "In," Declan said, gesturing to the dark square of the threshold. She hesitated, her shoes rooted to the Persian rug. "What is that?" "It's a reinforced core," he said, checking the slide of his weapon one last time. 8 inches of ballistic steel, separate ventilation. Cell service is jammed inside, but there is a landline connecting directly to my private security team in the basement. Go in." "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice barely a squeak. Declan finally looked at her. His pale blue eyes were dead. "I am going to fire an executive." The corporate euphemism made her stomach turn over. This wasn't a severance package. This was an execution. "Declan, wait!" she started, stepping toward him. It was the first time she had ever used his first name. His free hand shot out, grabbing her upper arm. His grip wasn't punishing, but it was immovable. He practically dragged her the last 3 feet and shoved her into the small, windowless room. The air inside smelled like canned oxygen and concrete. He stood in the doorway, blocking the ambient light from the office. "Listen to me very carefully," Declan said, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "Rule 1. You do not touch the door panel. Rule 2. You do not use the phone unless you hear the fire alarm. Rule 3. If anyone other than me enters this room, you pick up the Remington from the wall rack, point it at center mass, and empty it." She stared at him, the horror finally paralyzing her vocal cords. She just nodded. "I will come back for you," he promised quietly. He stepped back. The steel door swung shut. The lock engaged with a sound like a bank vault ceiling. She was plunged into total darkness for 3 agonizing seconds before a set of dim, amber emergency lights flickered on. The room was tiny, barely the size of a walk-in closet. There was a folding chair, a case of bottled water, a first aid kit, and a tactical shotgun mounted on the wall. She backed into the furthest corner, sliding down the cold concrete wall until she hit the floor. She pulled her knees to her chest and wrapped her arms around her legs. She couldn't hear the rain anymore. The reinforced walls killed all ambient noise from the city, but they didn't kill the sounds from the office. 10 minutes passed. Her watch ticked, the only sound in the sterile box. Then the heavy oak doors of the main office banged open. Muffled voices filtered through the steel. She couldn't make out the words, but she recognized the cadence. Sullivan's voice, sharp and defensive. Declan's voice, low and steady. A low rumble of thunder preceding a strike. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her palms flat against her ears. She didn't want to hear it. She had pulled the trigger just as surely as if she were holding the gun. She had handed Declan the ledger. She had condemned Sullivan to death. Her cynical mind tried to rationalize it. Sullivan set up Leo. Sullivan is a murderer. Sullivan is a monster. But she was the one who signed the warrant. The muffled argument abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was thick, heavy, and suffocating. Then came the sound. It wasn't like in the movies. It wasn't a dramatic, echoing boom. It was a flat, brutal crack. Just one, followed instantly by a heavy, sickening thud that vibrated through the floorboards beneath her. She gasped, a dry sob tearing out of her throat. She bit down on her own wrist to keep from screaming. Silence rushed back into the room, heavier and darker than before. It dragged on for what felt like hours. She sat in the amber light, shivering uncontrollably, waiting for the door to open, waiting to see if the man who walked in would be her boss or his lieutenant. 42 minutes later, the electronic keypad beeped. The heavy steel door swung open. Declan stood in the doorway. He had taken off his tie. His white dress shirt was pristine. There was no blood, but the smell of the office hit her like a physical blow. Cordite, ozone, and the distinct metallic tang of copper. He looked at her huddled on the floor. His expression softened, just a fraction, the cold deadness receding to reveal profound exhaustion. He walked into the panic room, crouched down in front of her, and reached out. She flinched. His hand stopped in midair. A muscle in his jaw twitched, a flash of genuine pain crossing his features before he masked it. He lowered his hand and let it rest on his own knee. "It's over," Declan said quietly. Sullivan resigned. She let out a wet, hysterical bark of laughter. "Did you give him severance?" "Tessa," he warned, his voice gentle but firm. "Look at me." She forced herself to meet his eyes. "He drew on me," Declan said, holding her gaze. "I confronted him with the wire transfer. He knew I had him cornered. He tried to unholster his weapon. I was faster." "And if you weren't," she whispered, her teeth chattering. "I am always faster," he stated, a simple matter of fact. He stood up and offered her his hand. "Come on, you can't stay in here." She stared at his hand. It was large, clean and steady, the hand of a killer, the hand of the man who had caught her when she fell. Slowly, she uncurled her fingers and placed her hand in his. He pulled her up effortlessly, but he didn't let go. He kept her hand secured in his, leading her out of the panic room. She deliberately kept her eyes fixed on the floor as they walked through the main office. She didn't want to look at the leather chairs. She didn't want to look at the Persian rug. But out of the corner of her eye, she saw a dark, damp stain sinking into the intricate wool pattern near the door, and two of Declan's enforcers standing quietly by a rolled-up tarp. Her stomach heaved. She stumbled, her knees buckling. Before she could hit the ground, Declan caught her. He scooped her up into his arms, carrying her bridal style. She buried her face in his chest, inhaling the scent of cedar and mint, trying to drown out the smell of the gunpowder. "I've got you," he murmured against her hair as he carried her out of the office. "Don't look. Just close your eyes. I've got you." They didn't go to her apartment. When Declan's armored SUV pulled out of the underground parking garage, it turned south, toward the financial district. Tessa sat in the passenger seat, wrapped in Declan's oversized suit jacket, staring blankly at the rain sliding down the tinted glass. "My cat needs to be fed," she said. It was a stupid, meaningless sentence, but it was the only thing tethering her to reality. "My detail picked up your cat an hour ago," Declan said from the driver's seat. He navigated the wet streets with one hand on the wheel. "She's already at my place. along with a week's worth of your clothes." She turned her head slowly to look at him. "You abducted my cat?" "I secured your dependents," he corrected dryly. Sullivan had loyalists. It will take a few days to root them out and ensure the hierarchy is stabilized. Until I know the ecosystem is clean, you do not go back to Brooklyn. Your apartment has a fire escape that practically invites a home invasion." She didn't have the energy to fight him. The adrenaline crash had hit her, leaving her hollowed out and utterly exhausted. They pulled into the private subterranean garage of a high-rise in Tribeca. A dedicated elevator took them straight to the penthouse. When the doors opened, she expected a dark, brooding mobster lair. Instead, she stepped into a sprawling, immaculate space, bathed in the warm glow of city lights filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows. It was minimalist, expensive, and surprisingly inviting. Her orange tabby cat, Barnaby, was currently asleep on a $10,000 white leather sofa. She walked over and buried her face in Barnaby's fur. He purred, oblivious to the fact that his owner had just facilitated a murder. Declan walked past her, heading straight for a sleek marble wet bar. He poured 2 glasses of water, not bourbon, and brought one over to her. "Drink," he ordered. She took the glass with trembling hands and managed a sip. The cold water shocked her system, clearing a little bit of the fog from her brain. Declan stood a few feet away, watching her intently. He had finally taken off his shoulder holster, tossing it carelessly onto a glass coffee table. Without the weapon, he looked slightly less intimidating, but the sheer size of him still dominated the room. "You're quiet," he observed. "I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to sleep tonight," she admitted, her voice hoarse. She gripped the glass tightly. "I'm trying to figure out how I go back to formatting Excel spreadsheets on Monday, knowing what I just did." Declan took a slow sip of his water. "You saved a man's life today, Tessa." "I ended one," she snapped, the guilt finally breaking through her numbness. "I gave you the information that got Sullivan killed." "Sullivan got Sullivan killed," Declan countered, his voice remaining level, grounding her panic. "He broke the rules. He stole from the family. He set up a brother to take the fall. In our world, that carries a mandatory sentence. You just accelerated the timeline." "I don't live in your world." "Yes, you do." He stepped closer, taking the half-empty glass from her shaking hands and setting it on a side table. "You always have. You just refused to look out the window." She let out a frustrated, tearless sob and backed away from him. "Why did you hire me, Declan?" 3 years ago. I was fresh out of business school. I didn't know anyone in your syndicate." "Why me?" Declan leaned against the back of the white sofa. He looked at her, a long, calculating stare that made her feel utterly exposed. "Because you were cynical," he said simply. "I interviewed a dozen candidates. Most of them were either terrified of the name Hayes, or they were thrill-seekers looking to play mob wife. You walked in, looked at the NDA, looked at the salary, and asked if dental was included." A humorless laugh escaped her lips. "I needed the money. You needed stability," he corrected. "And you didn't judge. You looked at the ledgers. You saw the discrepancies and you just balanced them. You were a vault." And he paused, his gaze dropping to the floor for a fraction of a second before meeting hers again. "You were the only person in my life who didn't look at me like I was a loaded gun." She stared at him. The ruthless, terrifying crime boss was standing in his living room, confessing a deeply human weakness. He was lonely. Surrounded by men who feared him, he had hired a cynical girl just to have someone in the room who treated him like a normal CEO. "But you are a loaded gun," she whispered. "I am," he agreed softly. He walked toward her, closing the distance slowly, giving her time to back away. She didn't move. And today you pulled the trigger. Not because you wanted to, but because you had to. Because you realized that playing neutral is just another way of choosing a side. He stopped directly in front of her. He reached out, his warm, calloused hands gently gripping her shoulders. "I can't let you go back to the way it was, Tessa," Declan murmured, his voice dropping into that hypnotic, vibrating register. "I can't let you sit outside my door, pretending you don't belong to this. The men know what you did today. Leo knows you saved him. You aren't my secretary anymore." "Then what am I?" she asked, her breath catching as his hand slid down her arms, his fingers lacing through hers. "You are my partner," Declan stated. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a proposal. It was a declaration of fact. "You run the clean money. I handle the dirt. And no one, absolutely no one, breathes in your direction without my permission." She looked down at their joined hands, her pale, slender fingers completely enveloped by his scarred, lethal ones. The sane, rational part of her brain screamed at her to run, to pack her bags, take her cat, and disappear into witness protection. But the cynical, grounded part of her knew the truth. She didn't want to run. For 3 years, she had craved this man's gravity. She had wanted the safety of his shadow, and now she was standing in it. She slowly looked up, meeting his pale blue eyes. "I want a raise," she said, her voice deadpan, though her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm. Declan stared at her for 2 seconds, before a slow, genuine smile broke across his face. It transformed him completely, wiping away the coldness and leaving something breathtakingly handsome in its wake. He didn't laugh. He just pulled her forward, wrapping his arms around her waist, and crushed his mouth against hers. The kiss was like the man himself, demanding, precise, and completely overpowering. She gasped against his lips, her hands flying up to grip the lapels of his ruined dress shirt. The fear, the adrenaline, the guilt, it all melted away in the sheer, overwhelming heat of his possession. She kissed him back, anchoring herself to the only solid thing in a world that had completely tilted off its axis. The transition wasn't marked by a parade or a formal announcement. It happened in the quiet, terrifying subtleties of power. A week later, Tessa walked into the lobby of Hayes Global Freight. Frank, the security guard, practically stood at attention, swiping her badge for her before she even reached the turnstile. When the private elevator doors opened on the 42nd floor, the silence wasn't the kind born of awkwardness. It was the silence of absolute, unquestioning respect. The stain on the Persian rug in Declan's office was gone. The rug had been entirely replaced overnight. Sullivan's name was quietly scrubbed from the corporate directory. Officially, he had moved to a consulting role overseas. Unofficially, his territory in South Boston had been absorbed by Leo Rossi, who now managed the docks with a newfound, almost religious fervor for keeping the ledgers perfectly balanced. She walked past her old desk in the antechamber. Someone had already cleared it. Her monitors were gone. Her ergonomic chair was missing. She didn't stop. She walked straight to the heavy oak doors of the inner office and pushed them open. Declan was sitting behind his desk. He looked up from a stack of manifests, his eyes locking onto hers. "You're late," he noted, his tone completely neutral. "The N train," she replied, walking across the room. She didn't stop at the wing-back chairs in front of his desk. She walked around the massive mahogany structure. Her new desk was situated adjacent to his, angled slightly so she could see the door, but entirely within his immediate peripheral vision. It was a physical manifestation of the new hierarchy. She was no longer the gatekeeper outside. She was the second in command inside. She set her bag down and booted up her new terminal. A thick file sat on her blotter. "Leo sent over the revised shipping schedules for the European imports," Declan said, not looking up from his paperwork. "He also sent a case of vintage Bordeaux to the penthouse. He wanted me to convey his profound gratitude for the recent audit." She booted up her spreadsheet software. "Tell Leo I prefer Pinot Noir, and if his depreciation margins are off by a single cent this quarter, I will personally audit his offshore accounts." Declan's pen stopped scratching across the paper. He turned his chair slightly, leaning back and resting his chin on his hand, watching her. The cold, calculating CEO was gone, replaced by a man looking at his most prized possession. "You're terrifying when you talk about taxes," Declan murmured. "Someone has to keep you animals legitimate," she shot back, typing rapidly. "Come here." The command was soft, but the undertone of absolute authority was still there. She stopped typing. She sighed, a performative show of annoyance that they both knew was completely fake, and pushed her chair back. She stood up and took the 2 steps separating their desks. Declan reached out, gripping her by the hips, and pulled her down. She landed sideways on his lap, perfectly mirroring the position from a week ago in the boardroom. But this time, there were no guns drawn. There was no panic. His left arm locked around her waist, settling heavily against her stomach, pulling her back flush against his chest. It was an anchor. It was safety. "I have quarterly projections to review, Declan," she said, though she made no effort to move. She rested her head back against his shoulder. "They can wait," he said, pressing a kiss to the curve of her neck. His breath sent a shiver down her spine. "Right now, I need my partner to look over the acquisition of a new warehouse in New Jersey." He reached around her, pulling a fresh file onto the blotter in front of them. She looked at the paperwork, surrounded by the scent of cedar, mint, and raw power. She was sitting on the lap of a monster. She was managing the finances of a criminal empire. The cynical girl who just wanted to pay her rent and feed her cat was dead, buried somewhere beneath the polished hardwood floors of a boardroom. In her place was a woman who understood the true currency of the world. She reached out, resting her hand over Declan's on the desk, and picked up a silver pen. "All right," she said, leaning back into his embrace. "Let's see what we're buying." They say absolute power corrupts absolutely, but they forget to mention how incredibly intoxicating it feels. Tessa stopped running from the shadows and learned how to command them, proving that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one holding the gun. It's the one balancing the books. If you loved this story of power, tension, and a deeply cynical romance, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a grounded mafia drama, and don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a chapter. Let us know in the comments. Would you have handed Declan the ledger? See you in the next one.